Moscow, city, capital of Russia, located in the far western part of the country. Since it was first mentioned in the chronicles of 1147, Moscow has played a vital role in Russian history. It became the capital of Muscovy, the Grand Principality of Moscow, in the late 13th century. Hence, the people of Moscow are known as Muscovites. Today, Moscow is not only the political center of Russia, but also the country's most populous city and its industrial, cultural, scientific, and educational capital. For more than 600 years, Moscow also has been the spiritual center of the Russian Orthodox Church. The capital of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics USSR until the Union dissolved in 1991, Moscow attracted world attention as a center of communist power. Indeed, the name of the seat of the former Soviet government and the successor Russian government, the Kremlin Russian, Krem, was a synonym for Soviet authority. The dissolution of the USSR brought tremendous economic and political change, along with a significant concentration of Russia's wealth into Moscow. Area 414 square miles, 1035 square kilometer per. 2010 city, 11,738,547, 2020 EST city, 12,678,079. If St. Petersburg is Russia's window on Europe, Moscow is Russia's heart. It is an upbeat, vibrant, and sometimes wearisome city. Much of Moscow was reconstructed after it was occupied by the French under Napoleon I in 1812 and almost entirely destroyed by fire. Moscow has not stopped being refurbished and modernized and continues to experience rapid social change. Russia's Soviet past collides with its capitalist present everywhere in the country, but nowhere is this contrast more visible than in Moscow. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's mausoleum remains intact, as do many dreary five-story apartment buildings from the era of Nikita Khrushchev's rule, the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, yet glitzy automobiles and Western-style supermarkets, casinos, and nightclubs are equally visible. Many Orthodox churches, as well as some synagogues and mosques, have been restored. Moscow's novel theaters have reclaimed leadership in the dramatic arts, and traditional markets have been revived and expanded. These markets, which under the Soviets were known as kolkhozs, collective farm markets, and sold mainly crafts and produce, are now more sophisticated retail establishments. It has become habitual to compare Moscow with St. Petersburg, its rival and the former 1712-1918 capital of Russia. While St. Petersburg has absorbed Western European influences, Moscow is viewed as a traditional Russian city. Unlike its rival, Moscow has a well-defined city center marked by the Kremlin. Other characteristics of Moscow are its physical layout in radial spokes and rings that have been extended over time, its hodgepodge of architectural styles, and its historical buildings that were mainly built by Russian architects. Moscow's buildings were predominantly wooden until the 1920s when brick and stone came into use. Moscow is located in western Russia, about 400 miles 640 kilometers southeast of St. Petersburg and 300 miles 480 kilometers east of the border with Belarus. It stands on the Moscow River, a tributary of the Oka and thus of the Volga, in the center of the vast plain of European Russia. The city and its surrounding area, the Moscow Oblast province, lie in the northwest corner of the most highly developed and densely populated part of Russia. Moscow is situated in the broad, extremely shallow valley of the Moscow River and its tributaries. The advances and retreats of glaciers during the Pleistocene epoch about 2,600,000 to 11,700 years ago deposited a thick mantle of boulder clays and morainic sands and gravels into which the sinuous Moscow River cut its wide valley in successive stages, marked by 4 corresponding levels. Geologically recent alluvial deposits cover their surfaces. Beside the river itself is a narrow belt of floodplain. A few feet above this is the first terrace, which yields to the successively higher second and third levels. The last of these terraces, rising up to 115 feet 35 meters above the river, is the most extensive, and much of Moscow is built on it. Northward, the third terrace merges imperceptibly with a plain of clays and sands, which slopes up very gradually to the Klindmitrov Morenic Ridge some 40 miles 60 kilometers north of the city. Similarly, eastward and southeastward the surface gradually merges into the vast, almost completely flat, and very swampy clay plain of the Meshchera lowland, which extends far beyond the city limits. Almost everywhere, surface relief is minor. The legend that Moscow was built on 7 hills, as Rome was, is an exaggeration, though there are a few small hills in and around the city center. Only in the southwest of the city is there an upland area, on Cretaceous rocks, covered by glacial morainic material. This is the Teplostanskaya upland, which rises more than 400 feet 120 meters above the Moscow River and which includes the highest elevation within Moscow's limits, 830 feet 250 meters above sea level. One of the sweeping bends of the river has cut into the edge of the Teplostanskaya upland a steep cliff, the Vorobayevi Hills, also known as the Sparrow Hills or the Lenin Hills, from the top of which there are panoramic views of the city. Long periods of occupation have extensively altered the natural setting of Moscow. The cultural layer, consisting of debris of buildings demolished long ago and of other materials deposited by humans, is up to 50 feet 15 meters deep in some parts of central Moscow. Almost all the small rivers and streams that once flowed into the Moscow River through the city area have now been put into underground conduits or have been filled in. There are still visible tributaries, however, i.e., the Yoja and 2 of its appendages on the left northern bank and the Setun. The Yoja and the Moscow are controlled by stone embankments for most of their winding courses through the city. The Moscow River has been diverted in places, with cuts made through the necks of its loops, and it has also been both widened and deepened. In certain places it is 800 feet 245 meters wide. In the past the river was icebound from November to April, but a channel is now kept open throughout the winter. The Yoja receives additional water from the Volga, by way of the Moscow Canal and its branch, the Lykobory Canal. 2 dams on its lower course have raised the level of the Yoja and have made the lower reaches navigable. Part of Moscow's water supply comes from some 1,000 deep bores in the city that tap the artesian water of the underlying carboniferous beds. Overuse has greatly lowered the levels of these underground waters, however, and most water needs are now met by surface sources, i.e., the reservoirs north of the city built in connection with the Moscow Canal, in particular the Uncha Reservoir. Water is also drawn from the Moscow River and pumped into underground storage reservoirs. The discharge of untreated sewage and industrial effluents polluted the Moscow River and adjacent groundwater until the mid-1960s, when anti-pollution and water purification measures were enforced. The climate of Moscow is dominated by westerly winds from the Atlantic. Precipitation is moderate, about 23 inches 580 millimeters a year. Snow is common, beginning usually about mid-November and lasting generally until mid-March. The city is well equipped to keep the streets clear. Winters are long, yet they are significantly milder than in similar climatic regions of North America. Southerly air streams occasionally bring days with temperatures above freezing. Conversely, northerly winds from the Arctic bring very sharp drops in temperature, often accompanied by clear, brisk weather with low relative humidity. Thus, although the January average temperature is 14 degrees Fahrenheit 10 degrees Celsius, there can be considerable variation. Temperatures have dropped to near 45 degrees Fahrenheit 43 degrees Celsius. Spring is relatively brief, and the temperature rises rapidly during late April. Summers are warm, and July, the warmest month, has an average temperature in the mid-60s of about 18 degrees Celsius. Temperatures nearing 100 degrees Fahrenheit 38 degrees Celsius have been reached in August. Rainy days are not uncommon, but the summer rainfall often comes in brief, heavy downpours and thunderstorms. Autumn, like spring, is short, with rapidly falling temperatures. Until the late 1950s there was increasing air pollution in Moscow. Smog was common, often with heavy concentrations of sulfur dioxide. A major campaign to control noxious emissions was launched, assisted greatly by a changeover from coal to natural gas as the principal fuel. Some factories that had contributed to pollution were moved out of the city. Slight improvement in Moscow's air had been marked, but since the 1980s the growing number of motor vehicles and the increase in the number of power generators have once again bolstered the concentrations of such exhaust pollutants as carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide in Moscow. The first documentary reference to Moscow is found in the early monastic chronicles under the year 1147, when on 4th April Yuri Vladimirovich Dolgoruki family, Prince of Suzdal, was host at a great banquet for his ally the Prince of Novgorod-Seversky in Moscow. This is the traditional date of Moscow's founding, although archaeological evidence shows that a settlement had existed on the site since Neolithic times. Archaeological work has also revealed the remains of corduroy roads and evidence of iron and leather working dating from the 11th century. Defense was essential to protect the growing settlement, and in 1156 Prince Dolgoruki built the first fortifications, earthen ramparts topped by a wooden wall with blockhouses. This was the Kremlin. The origin of the word Kremlin is disputed. Some authorities suggest Greek words for citadel or steepness, others the early Russian word krem, meaning a conifer providing timber suitable for building. The Kremlin was sited on the relatively high spit of land between the Moscow River and a small tributary, the Nigline. The triangular piece of land between the rivers was protected on the eastern side by a moat joining them. The Nigline now flows through an underground conduit, but part of its course is traced by a street of the same name. Moscow soon developed as one of the more important towns of the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal. A trading settlement, or posad, grew up to the east of the Kremlin, along the Moscow River in the area known as Jaryage. Like most other Russian towns, Moscow was captured and burned by the Tatars Mongols in their great invasion of 1236-40, and its princes had to accept Mongol suzerainty. It soon recovered, though the Tatars sacked it once again in 1293. 3 years later the Kremlin was strengthened with a new earthen wall and oak palace. Thereafter Moscow grew in importance, in trading and artisan activity, and in size, overtaking the older and previously more important centers of Suzdal and Vladimir. The town was fairly centrally placed in the system of rivers and portages that formed the trade routes across European Russia. The area east of Moscow between the Oka and Volga rivers had better soils than most of northern Russia and comprised a region of prosperous towns. Moscow's authority was greatly enhanced when in 1326 the Metropolitan of the Russian Orthodox Church transferred his seat from Vladimir to Moscow. Thereafter the town was to remain the center of Russian Orthodoxy, and after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks 1453 it claimed the title of the Third Rome. Under Ivan I the Principality of Vladimir was incorporated into that of Moscow. Gradually the princes of Moscow extended their rule over the other surrounding Russian princedoms, and the town became the leader in the long struggle against Mongol hegemony. The struggle at first fluctuated. In 1378 a Muscovite army repulsed a Mongol attack on the Volga River south of the town, and in 1380 Prince Dmitry of Moscow inflicted a crushing defeat on the Mongols under the great Khan Mame in the Battle of Kulikovo on the Don River, for which he was thereafter known as Dmitry Donskoy of the Don. The Kremlin had been enlarged and given walls and towers of white limestone in 1367, but the new fortifications were unable to withstand the renewed Mongol attack in 1382. Despite a heroic defense, Khan Tokhtamesh captured and plundered Moscow. However, another attack in 1408 under Khan Yedigey was beaten off. Moscow grew steadily in size and importance as it continued to absorb the surrounding princedoms. Within the Kremlin the first stone cathedral, of the Assumption, was built in 1326. Palaces for the prince and leading boyars, monasteries and churches were erected. Outside the Kremlin walls, the trading and artisan quarter to the east grew in size and became known as the Kitaygorod. This name, which originated in the 16th century, probably derives from the word kita, a binding of poles used in the fortifications before stone walls were built, and does not mean Chinese town, as it is sometimes translated. By the second half of the 15th century, especially after the annexation of Novgorod in 1478, Moscow had become the undisputed center of a unified Russian state. During the reign of the Grand Prince of Moscow Ivan III the Great, the Kremlin was again enlarged and given brick walls more than a mile in length and in some places up to 60 feet 18 meters high. From this period also date the rebuilt Cathedral of the Assumption and the equally beautiful Annunciation, and also rebuilt Archangel Cathedrals, the Palace of Facets, and the Bell Tower of Ivan III. In 1534-38 the Kitaygorod, previously protected only by earth banks and palisades, was also surrounded by a brick wall, with 12 towers. The town continued to grow and spread outside the walls to form what became known as the Belgorod White City in a semicircle around the Kremlin and Kitaygorod. Despite its new fortifications, Moscow remained subject to disaster and attack. In 1547 fires destroyed much of the town. In the mid-16th century, Ivan IV the Terrible conquered the Mongol Khanate of Kazan 1552 and Astrakhan 1556, but in 1571 the Crimean Tatars captured Moscow, burning everything but the Kremlin. The annals record that only 30,000 of 200,000 inhabitants survived. A further attack was launched by the Crimean Tatars in 1591, but they failed to overcome Moscow's stubborn resistance. The defense was helped by the new walls, some 5 miles 8 kilometers long, built of stone between 1584 and 1591 to protect the Belgorod. The wall's lines are marked today by the strip of parkland and tree-lined streets of the boulevard ring. In 1592 an outer earth rampart with 50 towers was erected around the city, including an area on the right bank of the Moscow River. This encompassed a further extension of Moscow that had grown up beyond the Belgorod, known at first as Skorodom. This outer sector came to be called the Zemlyanoy Gorod, or Earthen City. The garden ring traces the line of its fortifications. As an outermost line of defense, a chain of strongly fortified monasteries was established beyond the ramparts to the south and east, principally the Novodevichy Convent and Donskoy Don, Danilovsky, Simonov, Novospassky, and Andronikov monasteries, most of which now house museums. With much improved security, the products of artisans flourished. Distinct quarters were occupied by particular trades, for example, the suburbs of Bronnaya by armor makers, Kuznetskaya by blacksmiths, and Kotenniki by kettle makers. Across the Moscow River was the weavers' suburb. These artisan sectors are commonly commemorated today by street or quarter names. State workshops cast cannon and made weapons and gunpowder. The Tsar's court and its attendant nobility provided patronage for luxury crafts. Increasingly the boyars took over the Kitaygorod, with artisans and traders moving to the outer parts. The Kremlin became solely the seat of temporal and ecclesiastical authority. The center of commercial activity was the market in Red Square between the Kremlin and the Kitaygorod, where there were rows of stalls, each handling a specific variety of goods. The Russian word for red, krasnaya, which also meant beautiful in Old Russian, the common East Slavic language used until the late 13th century, was the original name for the square. Trade with Western Europe, especially England and Holland, as well as with Central Asia, Transcaucasia, Persia, and the Black Sea coast, was brisk, first forming a major staple in this international commerce. Foreign merchants lived in the Nemetskaya Sloboda, a German quarter, and a flourishing cultural life was marked by the growth of the book trade and the founding in 1553 of the first printing house. At the turn of the 17th century, Moscow, like the rest of Russia, suffered severely during the time of troubles. In the reign of Boris Godunov there were severe famines from 1601 to 1603. After Boris' death in 1605, the first false Dmitry seized Moscow with Polish help, and though he was killed in 1606 and the Poles were driven out, they reoccupied Moscow with a second false Dmitry in 1608-10. In May 1611 the Muscovites attacked the Poles, and the invaders retreated into the Kremlin. Under the energetic leadership of a boyar, Prince Dmitry Mikhailovich Pozharsky, and a merchant, Kuzma Minin, the Russians forced the Poles to surrender in October 1612. With the establishment in 1613 of the Romanov dynasty under Michael, relative peace returned to Moscow and with it further economic advance. Nevertheless, the conditions of the poor of the town often led to riots and uprisings. Similar events had also occurred in 1382, 1445, and 1547. In 1648, as a result of an increase in the salt tax, and again in 1662, the year of the so-called Copper Riots, there were disturbances by artisans, laborers, and tradesmen. The Great Revolt of Stenkaragin in southern Russia 1667-71 was echoed by unrest in the capital, and in 1671 Ragin was executed in Moscow as a warning to the city's inhabitants. The revolts were put down by the Streltsy hereditary militia, who in 1698, early in the reign of Peter I the Great, themselves revolted and were suppressed only by great slaughter. Despite the frequent upheavals, however, culture flourished. Russia's first higher educational institution, the Slavonic Greek Latin Academy attached to the Zakonospasky monastery in the Kitai-Gorod, dates from 1687. In 1701, Peter founded a school of mathematics and navigation. The first newspaper in Russia began publication in Moscow in 1703. In 1703, Peter I began constructing St. Petersburg on the Gulf of Finland, and in 1712 he transferred the capital to his new, westernized, and outward-looking city. Members of the nobility were compelled to move to St. Petersburg. Many merchants and artisans also moved. Both population growth and new building in Moscow languished for a time, but even during Peter's reign the city began to recover from the loss of capital status. Peter himself stimulated economic growth by establishing new industries, and private entrepreneurs followed suit. By 1725 there were some 32 new factories employing 5,500 workers. More than 20 of the factories were textile mills, including a crown enterprise making sailcloth. At the same period there were about 8,500 craft workers. During the 18th century, Moscow retained its major role in the cultural life of Russia. In 1755, on the initiative of the great man of letters and science Mikhail Vasilievich Lomonosov, Moscow University, now formerly M.V. Lomonosov Moscow State University, was founded. The first university in Russia, a medical and surgical college, was opened in 1786. Although serious fires did much damage in 1737, 1748, and 1752, many splendid new buildings appeared, designed by such architects as Giacomo Kurengi, Vasily Bashenov, Matvey Kaskov, and Vasily Stasov. In 1741, Moscow was surrounded by a barricade 25 miles 40 kilometers long, the Kemikolisky barrier, at whose 16 gates customs tolls were collected. Its line is traced today by a number of streets called Wall Rampart, and by place names such as Kaluga Zastava Customs Gate. Industry flourished, and by the end of the 18th century there were about 300 factories in Moscow, more than half of them textile mills. The population had grown to 275,000 by 1811. In 1812, Napoleon I invaded Russia. After a bitter 15-hour battle on 26 August 7 September, New Style at Borodino on the approaches to Moscow, the Russian commander-in-chief, Gen. M.I. Kutuzov, evacuated troops and civilians from the city, which was occupied by the French a week later. A fire broke out and spread rapidly, eventually destroying more than two-thirds of all the buildings. Looting was rife. The lack of supplies and shelter and the continual harassment by Russian skirmishing forces made it impossible for Napoleon to winter in Moscow, however, and on 7th October 19th October, New Style the French troops began their catastrophic retreat. In 1813, a commission for the construction of the city of Moscow was established. It launched a great program of rebuilding, which included a partial replanning of the city center. Among many buildings constructed or reconstructed at this time were the Great Kremlin and Armory Palaces, the university, the Manege Riding School, and the Bolshoi Theatre. Industry also recovered rapidly and continued to develop through the 19th century. In 1837, the Moscow Stock Exchange was established. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 and the beginning of the railway era with the opening of the line to St. Petersburg in 1851 greatly increased labor mobility, and large numbers of peasants from the villages began moving into Moscow. The population, which had reached 336,000 in 1835, had almost doubled to 602,000 in 1871, and by 1897 had reached 978,000. Moscow became the hub of Russia's railways, with trunk lines to all parts of European Russia. A ring of main line termini was built, mostly on or near the Kemikolisky barrier at the limits of the built-up area. Outside the barrier, many new factories, particularly those concerned with textiles, began operation. In the 1890s, heavy engineering and metalworking industries also developed. Between 1897 and 1915, Moscow yet again doubled in size to a population of 1,983,700. The later 19th century was a period of ostentatious building by public bodies and wealthy private persons in various imitative Old Russian styles and the so-called modern style. From this period date the town hall meeting place of the Gorodskaya Duma, former site of the Central Lenin Museum, the State Historical Museum, and the Upper Trading Rose now gum. The growth of an industrial proletariat in Moscow, together with the generally low living standards of the workers, brought unrest and strikes. Various revolutionary groups were active. In the revolution of 1905, a small-scale insurrection took place in Moscow, and an attempt was made to seize the Nikolaev now St. Petersburg station. The revolt was ruthlessly crushed. In 1917, although a council of workers and soldiers' deputies was set up in Moscow, the city remained relatively quiet until after the Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd on 25 October 7 November, New Style, which was immediately followed by fighting in Moscow. Military cadets held out for a time in the Kremlin, but by 3 November 16 November, New Style they were overcome and Bolshevik power was firmly established. The inhabitants of Moscow are overwhelmingly of Russian ethnicity. The largest minority groups are Ukrainians, Belarusians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and Tatars. In addition, it is estimated that there were about a few 100,000 undocumented immigrants from Vietnam, Afghanistan, and China residing in the Moscow area at the beginning of the 21st century.